The first thing James Wilson noticed when he pulled into the gravel driveway of his late uncle's property was the well. It stood there, a modest stone structure with a wooden roof like a sentinel guarding the 2-acre lot that now belonged to him. The April sunshine glinted off the metal handle of the hand pump, making it shine like a beacon. Something about it made him pause before getting out of his truck. This wasn't just any well, it was a piece of family history. James hadn't expected to inherit anything from Uncle Frank. They hadn't been particularly close, with the occasional holiday visit or birthday card being the extent of their relationship. But when the lawyer had called to inform him that Frank had left him his property in the rural outskirts of Millfield, James had been genuinely surprised. At 35, newly divorced and renting an overpriced apartment in the city, the prospect of owning land felt like a lifeline thrown his way. It's not exactly a mansion, the lawyer had warned him, but it's good land with good water. That well has never run dry, even in the worst droughts. Now, stepping out of his truck and approaching the well, James ran his hand over the smooth, cool stones. According to the deed, the well had been dug by his great-grandfather in 1923, long before the surrounding area had been developed into the mishmash of rural properties and suburban-style neighborhoods it was today. "Can I help you?" A sharp voice cut through his thoughts. James turned to see a woman standing at the edge of his property. She was in her 50s, with meticulously highlighted blonde hair cut into a severe bob. She wore pressed khaki pants and a polo shirt with a small embroidered logo that read Oak Ridge Estates HOA. "I'm James Wilson. This is my property now," he replied, extending a hand that the woman ignored. "I'm Diane Lowell, president of the Oak Ridge Estates Homeowners Association," she said, her eyes narrowing as she took in his faded jeans and work boots. "I wasn't aware that Frank had relatives. We were expecting the property to go up for auction." There was something in her tone that set off alarm bells in James' mind. She spoke as if his ownership of the property was an inconvenience to be dealt with rather than a legal fact. Well surprised, James said with a forced smile, "Uncle Frank left it to me in his will." Diane's gaze shifted to the well. "I hope you're aware that your uncle's property, while not officially part of our HOA, is subject to certain easements and local ordinances. That well, for instance, is a safety hazard and an eyesore." James felt a flicker of irritation. "This well has been here for 100 years. It's perfectly safe, and it's on my property." "Be that as it may," Diane said, her voice clipped, "we have standards in this community. Your uncle was difficult about maintaining his property in a way that didn't detract from neighborhood values." James could almost hear Uncle Frank's gruff voice in his head. "Those HOA vultures have been trying to get their hands on my land for years. Don't let them push you around, boy." "I'll keep that in mind," James replied noncommittally. "For now, I'm just getting acquainted with my new property." Diane handed him a thick envelope. "Here's some information about local regulations and community expectations. I suggest you read it carefully." Her smile didn't reach her eyes. "Welcome to the neighborhood, Mr. Wilson." As she walked away, James couldn't shake the feeling that this was less a welcome and more a declaration of war. He turned back to the well, placing his hand protectively on the stones. Something told him that this simple structure, this connection to his family's past, was about to become the center of a battle he hadn't anticipated fighting. Little did he know just how far Diane Lowell would go to get her. 2 weeks after moving onto his uncle's property, James was beginning to feel at home. He spent his days clearing overgrown brush, fixing loose boards on the small cabin, and researching the well's history at the county records office. The more he learned about the property, the more connected he felt to it, and to the family roots he'd never fully appreciated before. The well, as it turned out, wasn't just any water source. County records confirm it tapped into an underground spring that provided some of the purest water in the region. Before municipal water lines had been installed in the 1970s, several neighboring properties had agreements with James' great-grandfather to access the well. Those easements had expired decades ago, but the quality of the water remained exceptional. James had taken a sample to be tested, and the results had surprised even him. The mineral content was perfectly balanced, with trace elements that gave it a sweetness rarely found in modern water supplies. He began to entertain the idea of bottling it as a small side business, maybe even restoring the old spring house on the property. It was while he was cleaning debris from around the well that he noticed the white SUV parked at the edge of his property. Diane Lowell stood beside it, gesturing animatedly while talking to a man in a business suit. They both held papers and occasionally pointed toward his property, specifically toward the well. James wiped his hands on his jeans and walked over. "Afternoon," he said, making both of them jump slightly. "Something I can help you with?" Diane recovered quickly, her smile tight and practiced. "Mr. Wilson, this is Robert Gaines, our HOA attorney. We were just discussing some concerns about your property." "My property isn't part of your HOA," James reminded her, keeping his voice level, "as I'm sure your attorney can confirm." Robert Gaines cleared his throat. "Technically correct, Mr. Wilson. However, there are certain covenants that affect all properties in this area, dating back to when the land was first subdivided in the 1960s. My uncle owned this land free and clear, James replied. I've reviewed all the documents with my own attorney. Yes, well, Diane cut in. We're particularly concerned about that antiquated water feature. She gestured toward the well. It's a liability issue. Children from the neighborhood could wander onto your property and fall in. James couldn't help but laugh. It's capped and secured, has been for decades, and your neighborhood is a quarter-mile away behind a wooded area. Nevertheless, gains continue. The HOA board has voted to request that you either properly fill it in or build an approved decorative structure around it that complies with community aesthetic standards. He handed James a glossy brochure showing various stone veneer structures that looked nothing like the authentic historical well on his property. This is ridiculous, James said, handing the brochure back. The well is historic, functional, and completely safe. Not to mention it's on my private property that isn't subject to your HOA rules. Diane's friendly facade dropped. Mr. Wilson, your uncle was stubborn too. But times change and that eyesore needs to go. The Oak Ridge community is expanding and your property is becoming surrounded by our development. Eventually, you will either comply or sell. Something in her tone told James this wasn't really about safety or aesthetics. Is there something else going on here, Ms. Lowell? Something about the well specifically that bothers you? A flicker of something. Annoyance? Worry? Crossed Diane's face before she regained her composure. Don't be paranoid, Mr. Wilson. We're simply concerned about community standards and safety. As they left, James noticed Diane take a phone call, her voice dropping to a whisper as she glanced back at the well with what looked like genuine concern. James spent the next week methodically documenting everything about his property. He installed trail cameras in the trees surrounding the perimeter, photographed the well from every angle, and had a professional surveyor come out to officially mark his property lines. Rachel Diaz had advised him to create as much documentation as possible, warning that HOA disputes could turn ugly. They'll use any technicality they can find, she cautioned. And some HOAs don't always play by the rules. James had laughed at that. What are they going to do? Sneak onto my property in the middle of the night? As it turned out, that was exactly what they were planning. On a Friday morning in early May, James left for a 2-day trip to visit his sister in the next county. He'd been putting off the visit for weeks, but with the growing tension over his property, he needed someone to talk to in person. He locked up the cabin, checked that his security cameras were working, and headed out, unaware that Diane Lowell had been watching his routines, waiting for just such an opportunity. At 6:30 the next morning, while James was having breakfast with his sister 8 miles away, a white unmarked van pulled up to his property. The driver was careful to park behind a cluster of pine trees out of view from the main road. 3 men in gray coveralls emerged, followed by Diane Lowell in her crisp khakis and a hard hat that seemed more for show than protection. Remember, she was saying as they gathered equipment from the van, this is an emergency environmental remediation. We have authorization from the county to seal this hazardous water access point. The foreman, a burly man named Mike, looked uncertain. You said you had paperwork? I'd like to see that before we start. Diane handed him an official-looking document with the county letterhead. Mike skimmed it, noting the signature at the bottom and an impressive array of official stamps. All right, he said, handing it back. Let's get this done quick. In and out in 2 hours. What Mike didn't know, what he couldn't know without carefully examining the document's identification numbers, was that the permit was for a different property entirely, one that Oak Ridge Estates had legitimately been authorized to remediate due to contamination concerns. Diane had simply changed the address and property description while keeping the official signatures and seals intact. The work crew moved efficiently. They broke the lock on the well cap, examined the stone structure, and began mixing quick-setting cement in large buckets. One of the workers, younger than the others, looked around nervously. Shouldn't we notify the owner? He asked. The HOA has already handled that, Diane replied smoothly. This property is being cited for multiple violations. The owner has been notified but has ignored all official warnings. This was, of course, a complete fabrication. James had received no such warnings because his property wasn't subject to HOA rules and the county had issued no citations. But the workers, accustomed to following orders and believing they were performing legitimate work, continued without further questions. They poured bucket after bucket of cement down the well shaft, filling it completely. Then they created a concrete cap over the top, effectively sealing it forever. The beautiful stone structure remained, but it was now nothing more than a decorative monument to what had once been a living, functional connection to the aquifer below. We should remove the whole structure, Mike suggested, looking at the old stonework. No, Diane said quickly. This is sufficient. We've eliminated the safety hazard, which was our only concern. What she didn't say was that completely removing the well would be too obvious. This way, at a glance, everything looked the same. It might take days or even weeks for James to realize what had happened beneath the cap. Deputy Sheriff Mark Holloway had seen plenty of neighbor disputes in his 15 years on the force, but this was something else entirely. He sat in James' living room, watching the security footage for the third time, his expression growing more serious with each viewing. "Let me get this straight," he said, pausing the video on a clear shot of Diane Lowell handing documents to the work crew foreman. "She falsified county permits, hired a crew to trespass on your property, and permanently destroyed a century-old well that's documented in historical records." "That about sums it up," James replied, his voice steady despite the anger still simmering beneath the surface. Deputy Holloway shook his head. "I've dealt with HOA complaints before. This crosses several lines. We're looking at criminal trespass, destruction of property, document forgery, and possibly fraud, depending on what she told that work crew." Rachel Diaz, who had arrived an hour after James' call, was already taking notes. "Don't forget interfering with a water source, which carries additional penalties in this state. Plus, there's the historical value of the structure." "I want to press charges," James said firmly. "All of them." The deputy nodded. "I'll need to take your statement and the video evidence. This will likely involve multiple departments: criminal investigation, property crimes, and possibly the district attorney's office." He glanced around the modest cabin. "Does Ms. Lowell know about your cameras?" "I doubt it. I installed them discreetly, and I never mentioned them to anyone from the HOA." A hint of a smile crossed Deputy Holloway's face. "That's going to make for an interesting conversation." That conversation happened sooner than any of them expected. As they were finishing up the initial report, the sound of tires on gravel announced a visitor. Through the window, James could see Diane Lowell's white SUV pulling into his driveway. She emerged looking confident, a folder tucked under her arm. "Well, speak of the devil," muttered Deputy Holloway, adjusting his uniform. "Let's see what she has to say for herself." Diane's confident stride faltered when she spotted the sheriff's vehicle. Her steps slowed as she approached the front door, but she quickly regained her composure, plastering on a professional smile as James opened the door before she could knock. "Mr. Wilson," she began, then stopped short at the sight of the uniformed deputy and the stern-faced woman in a business suit. I wasn't aware you had company." "Ms. Lowell," James replied coolly, "please come in. This is Deputy Sheriff Holloway and my attorney, Rachel Diaz. We were just discussing the criminal activity that took place on my property yesterday morning." The color drained from Diane's face, but she recovered quickly. "I don't know what you're talking about. I came by to discuss the county's enforcement action regarding your non-compliant well structure. I have the paperwork right here." She attempted to hand James the folder she was carrying. "You mean you falsified paperwork?" James asked, not taking it. "The same documents you showed to the work crew you hired to trespass on my property and destroy my well?" "That's a ridiculous accusation," Diane said, her voice rising slightly. "The county environmental office authorized emergency remediation of a hazardous structure. Everything was done by the book." Deputy Holloway stepped forward. "Ma'am, I've already spoken with the county environmental office. They issued no such authorization for this property." "There must be some mistake," Diane insisted, opening her folder and pulling out a document. "It's right here." "Would you mind if I see that?" the deputy asked, taking the paper from her trembling hands. He examined it carefully. "Ma'am, this permit number belongs to a property on Lakeside Drive that was cited for chemical contamination 3 months ago. Someone has altered the address and property description." He looked up at her pointedly. "That's forgery of a government document, which is a felony in this state." Diane's professional facade cracked. "You can't prove I had anything to do with that. The HOA received this document from the county." "Actually," James interrupted, turning his laptop toward her, "we can prove exactly what you did." He pressed play on the security footage. Diane's eyes widened as she watched herself directing the cement truck, giving instructions to the work crew, and explicitly telling them not to file additional paperwork. You are recording me," she stammered, her indignation momentarily overriding her panic. That's an invasion of privacy." Rachel Diaz spoke up for the first time. "Ms. Lowell, there is no expectation of privacy when you're trespassing on someone else's property and committing multiple felonies. The cameras were legally installed by the property owner to monitor his land." Deputy Holloway closed his notebook. "Ms. Lowell, I'm going to need you to come down to the station and answer some questions about this incident." "This is absurd," Diane said, her voice shaking now. "I'm the president of the Oak Ridge Estates Homeowners Association. Do you have any idea why I'm in this community?" "Yes, ma'am," the deputy replied calmly. "Right now, you appear to be someone who's committed several serious crimes. You can come voluntarily to give your statement, or I can place you under arrest. Your choice." For a moment, Diane looked like she might argue further. Then her shoulders slumped. "I'll follow you to the station. but I want my attorney present before I answer any questions. As Deputy Holloway escorted Diane out, Rachel turned to James. This is just the beginning. The criminal charges are one thing, but we should also file a civil suit immediately. The damages here are substantial. The Millfield County Courthouse was an imposing structure of red brick and white columns, built in 1892 and largely unchanged since then. As James climbed the worn marble steps beside Rachel, he felt the weight of history pressing down on him. Generations of disputes have been settled behind these walls. Boundary disagreements, water rights conflicts, and property battles of all kinds. Today was the preliminary hearing for Diane Lowell's criminal case, followed by a separate meeting with her attorneys regarding James's civil suit. The past 3 weeks have been a whirlwind of depositions, evidence submissions, and increasingly desperate attempts by the Oak Ridge Estate's HOA to distance itself from its president's actions. Remember, Rachel said quietly as they passed through the security checkpoint, "Don't react to anything she says. The criminal proceedings are just the beginning. Our civil case is where we'll really make her pay." The courtroom was nearly full. Local interest in the case had exploded, especially after an enterprising reporter had discovered that the Oak Ridge Estate's development plans included redirecting water from multiple properties, not just James' well. Several affected landowners sat in the gallery, nodding to James as he entered. Diane sat at the defendant's table, flanked by 2 attorneys in expensive suits. She looked smaller somehow, her perfectly highlighted hair less lustrous, her posture less commanding. When she glanced up and saw James, a flash of undisguised hatred crossed her face before she quickly looked away. "All rise." The bailiff called as Judge Eleanor Martinez entered the courtroom. The proceedings moved quickly. Diane's attorneys entered a plea of not guilty to all charges: criminal trespass, destruction of property, forgery of government documents, fraud, and interference with the water source. The judge set a trial date for 3 months later and denied the defense's motion to suppress the video evidence. "Your Honor," Diane's lead attorney argued, "the placement of those cameras was designed to entrap my client. There were no posted notices about video surveillance." Judge Martinez peered over her glasses. "Counselor, your client had no legal right to be on that property in the first place. The owner has every right to monitor his own land without announcing it to potential trespassers." She closed the file decisively. The video evidence stands. As they left the courtroom, Robert Gaines, the HOA attorney James had met during Diane's first visit to his property, approached them anxiously. "Mr. Wilson, Ms. Diaz," he said, his voice low, "I've been authorized by the HOA board to discuss a potential settlement of your civil claims. They're very concerned about the negative publicity this case is generating." Rachel raised an eyebrow. "We'll be in conference room C in 30 minutes. Bring your best offer." The conference room was sterile and windowless, with a large oak table that had seen decades of negotiations, settlements, and compromises. James sat quietly as the lawyers engaged in the carefully choreographed dance of legal bargaining. "The HOA is prepared to offer $20,000 for the damages to Mr. Wilson's property," Gaines began, sliding a document across the table. "In exchange, we ask for a full release of all claims against the association and its members, including Ms. Lowell." Rachel didn't even pick up the paper. That's not even close to adequate. The well was a historical structure with significant value. The cost to restore it, if it even can be restored, would exceed $30,000 alone. Add in the loss of water rights, emotional distress, punitive damages for the intentional nature of the destruction. She let the sentence hang in the air. The HOA wasn't directly involved, Gaines protested weakly. Ms. Lowell acted independently. She acted as president of the HOA, using HOA resources to further a development plan that would benefit the entire association, Rachel countered. "You're all complicit." The negotiations continued for hours. By late afternoon, the offer had reached $35,000, but Rachel remained unmoved. $50,000, she said finally, plus a written acknowledgement that Mr. Wilson's property is exempt from any and all HOA regulations, current and future. And we wanted in writing that the spring feeding as well as his exclusive property, if no claims from Oak Ridge Estates on the water rights. Gaines looked pained. "I'll have to take this back to the board." "You do that," Rachel replied, "and remind them that we haven't even begun discovery on how many other homeowners were involved in this scheme. I'm sure the media would be very interested in those development plans I've seen." As Gaines departed, James finally spoke up. $50,000 seems like a lot. Rachel gathered her papers. "It's actually less than we could get if we went to trial. But money isn't really the point here, is it?" James thought about the well, about Uncle Frank's stubborn protection of the property, about the generations of his family who had drawn clean water from the earth at that very spot. "No," he admitted. "It's about making sure this never happens again." 2 days later, Rachel called with news. The HOA had accepted their terms. $50,000 in damages, and a legally binding agreement acknowledging James's complete ownership of his property and water rights, with no HOA interference permitted ever. "They're running scared," Rachel explained. "After your case made the news, 3 other property owners came forward with similar complaints about Diane and the HOA trying to bully them out of their water rights. The county commissioners are now investigating the entire development plan." James sat on his porch, foam in hand, staring at the stone well. Yellow caution tape still surrounded it from the sheriff's investigation. Soon he would hire experts to see if the cement could be removed without damaging the original structure, though everyone acknowledged it was a long shot. The certified check for $50,000 arrived on a Tuesday morning along with a thick envelope of legal documents and a single sheet of HOA letterhead. James sat at his kitchen table, spreading everything out before him like a peculiar jigsaw puzzle. The check itself was surreal. More money than he'd ever seen in one place, payment for a mistake that had been anything but accidental. He picked up the single sheet of letterhead last. Diane Lowell's apology was exactly 3 sentences long. "I, Diane Lowell, hereby acknowledge that on May 15th I authorized and directed the illegal filling of the historic well on the Wilson property. I recognize that my actions were unlawful and caused significant damage to a valuable historical structure and water source. I sincerely apologize for my actions and accept full responsibility for the consequences." Her signature at the bottom was sharp and angular, pressed so hard into the paper that it had nearly torn through. James could almost feel the rage behind each pen stroke. This wasn't an apology, it was a surrender document signed under duress. He set it aside and picked up the phone to call Rachel. "Did you see the apology?" he asked when she answered. Rachel laughed. "I did. Probably the least sincere apology I've ever read, but it meets the legal requirements. And more importantly, along with the check and those legal documents, it gives you everything we fought for." "So what now?" James asked, looking out the window at the well still surrounded by caution tape. "Now you decide what to do with your victory," Rachel replied, "and your $50,000. The answer came to James later that day when he met with Carter Thompson, a hydrogeologist who specialized in historical water structures. They stood beside the well as Carter examined the damage, shaking his head grimly. "The concrete they used is industrial grade," he explained, kneeling to examine where it had bonded with the original stonework. "Simply drilling it out would likely collapse the entire structure. And even if we could remove it completely, the spring channel below has likely been permanently blocked." James' heart sank. "So it's destroyed. For good." Carter stood, brushing dirt from his knees. "This specific well, yes, but the spring itself." He pointed to a subtle change in the vegetation about 15 feet from the well. "See how the grass is greener there? The water is finding a new path. The spring is still active beneath your property." A spark of hope flared in James's chest. "You mean I could dig a new well?" "Better than that," Carter said, walking toward the greener patch. "You could restore the entire system. Based on the county records you showed me, your great-grandfather didn't just dig a well. He built a small spring house and a series of collection pools. The current well was just one access point to a much larger water management system." He pulled out his tablet and showed James a digital reconstruction based on the historical records. "With your settlement money, you could build something remarkable here. Something that honors the original design but incorporates modern filtration and collection methods. You could even bottle the water commercially if you wanted to."